Hey comrades, welcome to the Revolution Report. Today we have another reaction video for you. A lot of you have been talking about Johnny Harris's newest video, Why Putin is Going to Lose This War. For those of you who don't know, this is the same guy that we did the last reaction video to here, and we've got a lot to talk about in regards to it. So we've also got with us today to join in the reaction Noor from the Revolution Report Politburo, and Lady Izdahar, who has her own YouTube channel, her own TikTok and Instagram. Do you want to introduce yourself a little bit, Lady Izdahar?
Assalamu alaikum, comrades. My name is Izdahar, and I'm a historian on Eastern Europe and Russia. I primarily focus on cultural history, and you can find me all places online under Lady Izdahar.
Cool. Well, let's jump right in.
Еще раз подчеркну, что Украина для нас это не просто соседняя страна. Это неотъемлемая часть нашей собственной истории, культуры, духовного пространства.
First of all, right at the beginning, it's like, big bad Putin, evil military man. It's already clear how this is gonna go.
Considering that there's no translations of what's being said in the background either.
Yeah, that's true. It's just kind of like, you know, I guess it doesn't really matter for Johnny Harris, just scary Russian-sounding stuff, so...
Пространство. Это наши товарищи, близкие, среди которых не только коллеги, друзья, бывшие сослуживцы.
Why are you doing this? Why are you fighting this needless war?
I think it's interesting that he's like talking directly to Putin as if he has some sort of deep connection. Why are you doing this, Mr. Putin?
Yeah, as if they're like old friends. You know what's funny though about the translation? I was listening to what Putin was actually saying after you said that, and he's like, "These people are our friends, our compatriots." All this scary music is going on in the background.
This war of conquest that will topple so many...
Okay, first of all, war of conquest. Right off the bat, right from the beginning, Johnny Harris starts his video with something that's not true. This is like the first thing that Vladimir Putin said at the beginning of this military operation, that this is not a war of conquest, and they don't plan for any sort of military occupation, and they don't want to overthrow the Ukrainian government.
Lives. He sent his forces, his missiles, in the middle of the night. These are the troops, hundreds of thousands of them, that had been camped out on the border for months. Troops that Putin had insisted were there for a routine military exercise, and that the US and UK intel swore were actually preparing to invade. Many around the world, including in Ukraine, thought that this was just the West being dramatic, stoking the tensions. But the intel was exactly right.
His entire introduction seems very self-important to me. He's, intermixing videos from, the conflict, videos of Putin, evil music, and him just like typing away and making maps. Granted, he makes wonderful maps.
Yeah. It
just seems like he's inserting himself to this kind of strange degree that kind of gives off narcissistic to me. Maybe that's an extreme word, but right away when you're introducing such a serious topic, especially trying to be someone to be taken seriously, the fact that he's inserting himself to this degree in the narrative is kind of concerning.
Oh yeah, I agree 100%. I think it's like he immediately tries to sell himself as a very serious journalist. He's doing very serious typey on the computer things, making graphics and all this, when, I mean, the production value obviously is very high, but as we're going to see soon, the content, the actual analysis of what he's putting forward is very, very, like, superficial. I mean, we could first look at the fact that he's saying that he's trying to frame this whole situation like US intelligence services were saying that Russia was going to invade this whole time, and nobody listened to the poor CIA, and they were right the whole time, when that's not even how it played out. Everyone knows, like, I mean, this military operation came as a surprise to everyone in the Russian government because it wasn't even planned At the time that these Western media outlets were saying months ago that Russia was planning to invade, I mean, this all started when the Ukrainian military actually renewed an offensive against Donbass and started saying that it was going to get nuclear weapons. These were factors that were not part of the equation back when the media was saying in December and in January that Russia was planning this large-scale invasion. It's like this Western myth that these two situations are connected. The beginning of this military operation and the fact that the CIA was saying that Russia was planning an invasion all this time. It wasn't.
It's like sending someone in a room where sneezing is banned and that room is full of dust. And the guy outside says that, I just know he's going to sneeze. And when that person actually goes inside that room, he sneezes. And the guy outside says, oh, I told you he's going to sneeze. That's how it's like.
Yeah, and I would even add to that idea that about the sneezing and the dust, that you also have to add into the equation the fact that the guy who's saying, that guy's definitely going to sneeze in that dusty room, was also the guy who put all the dust in there in the first place. Yeah. He made that room dusty so that guy could sneeze. And then said it was, that he just knew all along he was going to sneeze.
Most of those troops crossed the border last week and are now inside the country.
Russian military vehicles, including tanks, entering Ukraine.
The invasion, the attack that Russia promised would never happen, has now started.
The country is being attacked from all directions.
Hours after this invasion started in the middle of the night on Thursday morning, Ukraine's President Zelensky appeared on TV, not just to talk to his people, but to speak directly to Russians themselves.
Now, before we go any further, I think it's also important to note that there's no mention of Donbass here at all. He just says that, he doesn't even mention that Donbass declared its independence from Ukraine 8 years ago, and that they signed, that they had been calling for Russian help for years already, actually, and they had signed joint military cooperation pacts before this happened. So it's not just like the Russian military is just invading Ukraine. They actually, the main goal was to actually help the People's Republics defend themselves against the Ukrainian military that's been terrorizing them for 8 years.
Я обращаюсь к российским гражданам как гражданин Украины.
We share a border of over 2,000 kilometers, and along this border, your troops are stationed, almost 200,000 soldiers. Your leaders just approved them to make a step towards us, into the territory of another country.
И этот шаг
This step is likely the beginning of a massive war on the European continent.
I think it's worth noting that, first of all, we know he's great at making maps. That's something that he does. And he's marking Crimea as being a disputed area. But for someone who's so into geography and map making, it is shocking that he isn't putting up the People's Republics in his maps.
Yeah, it's completely left out, and you see on his graphics the Russian troops entering from the east. That's just he's portraying that as if it's an invasion of Ukraine, when those are independent people's republics.
It's a war unlike any war the world has ever seen. It looks like a war from 1830, but it's happening in 2022.
Okay. He says, this is a war unlike any war the world has ever seen. It looks like a war from 1830. At first, I was thinking maybe he was referring to the Crimean War, but that was in the 1850s. So that's not even the right time period. 1830s is French Revolution, right? So what is he even referencing? I think it's kind of, again, for having this professional persona, it's kind of weird to be so dismissive about the past and past wars. It's something that only happens in the 1800s, as if there aren't currently wars going on, if there isn't US aggression in the Middle East, or as if Yugoslavia never happened. So maybe think about, what does he mean by wars like this? What is he really saying with that?
Yeah, I know. I think it kind of speaks to this tendency, this Eurocentric chauvinistic tendency with regard to wars. Like, everyone's shocked that there's a war now happening in Europe, but they weren't shocked when the US, for example, carpet bombed, completely annihilated the Iraq, overthrew the government, killed 1 million people. Like, but that happened, I guess, like to brown people or something, and so they don't. That's not considered. I mean, in comparison to like the U.S. invasion of Iraq, what's going on in Ukraine right now is like very tame.
It's probably trying to show that Russian barbaric hordes are coming from the east, attacking the civilized West. We've seen how they portrayed it in the media as well. One of the guys, I believe it was NBC or CBC, he said that how Ukraine is civilized, and he said that this isn't Afghanistan or Iraq. I mean, what do you even mean by that?
Right, it's a civilized European country. I think that was actually CNN where that happened.
I don't know the specifics, but I'm sure you can find it. Someone pointed out that up to this day, the amount of bombs that have been dropped in Ukraine only amount to a single day of what was going on last spring in Palestine.
And I mean, I just want to bring up other examples of absolutely horrific wars that have happened since 1830, this random date that Johnny decided to bring up. I mean, like, what about the Korean War, in which like 80% of North Korea's industrial base was completely destroyed? Napalm was used in completely horrific ways, burning the flesh off of civilians. Vietnam, like, these were horrific, absolutely horrific wars in comparison to what's going on right now in Ukraine. I mean, war sucks, of course. You know, war is not good, but comparison to those, I mean, let's be real. This is why this is why Russia's calling it a military operation, and you know, because it's not comparable to things like that.
U.S. generals were bragging about the Korean War. They said that we killed off 20% of the population. That's what they were saying out in the public. And I don't know how you can compare those two things and just like say that. History to this guy is like 1830 to 2022, nothing happened, and in 2022 this happened.
And if you want to learn more about the Korean War, make sure to check out our DPRK miniseries.
Putin's army is much stronger than Ukraine's, at least in terms of numbers. If he really wants to, he probably is going to be able to take over the country's major population centers and oust the Ukrainian government. The US and NATO can't send troops for fear of starting a clash between two nuclear nations, something we simply do not do. It's a red line that no one crosses. I want to tell you exactly why Vladimir Putin and his army are here. The story behind this invasion is the story of this one man's worldview. But it's
I just hate this like liberal idea that you can understand world politics through psychoanalyzing some world leader, or really what the portrayal of a world leader that you see in the media, because it's not like they're friends. It's not like he like knows Putin personally, you know. It's like he boils the entire conflict down to the imagined ambitions of one man, of Vladimir Putin, the crazy, narcissistic imperialist.
It's also a story of a bet that he took. A bet that Ukrainians would give up, lay down their arms, and see the world the way he does. But if there's anything I have learned in the past week, it's that even if Putin conquers a big portion of this country, something he has the military hardware to do, even if he does that, he still won't win this war. In fact, I'm here to argue that he's already lost.
I'm just really curious what his personal idea of winning means. I don't think he explicitly mentions his perception of what winning means, but that's something that really confuses me. Even if he does take big portions of Ukraine, he won't win. So what is winning in this guy's eyes?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, I really think that the way Johnny sees it is that a Russian victory would mean like militarily occupying Ukraine and conquering it and making it part of Russia. This is like a kind of straw man, because that's exactly what Russia said it's not there to do from the beginning. Russia's made its demands very clear. They've said they want Ukraine to be demilitarized. They don't want it to be a military threat to Russia. They want it to be neutral. They don't want it to be part of NATO. and they want it to be denazified. They want to hold basically Nuremberg trials version 2 for these neo-Nazis that are in the Ukrainian military that have been committing these war crimes, really, for the past 8 years against Donbass. So the Russian version of winning is, it doesn't involve military occupation and overthrowing the Ukrainian government, but for some reason Johnny seems to think that's the case.
Big explosions taking place in Kiev right now.
People here are going to be waking up to a very different country than the one they went to sleep in.
We are getting just non-stop reports of attacks and Russian strikes from all across the country.
Vladimir Putin has already lost this war. And to understand what I'm talking about, you have to look at two things. Number one, what Putin said right before the invasion. And number two, what actually happened once he invaded. I want to show you both. So a few days before the invasion, Putin gets on TV and addresses the nation.
Уважаемые граждане России, дорогие друзья.
It's this unsurprising hour-long history lecture where Putin lays out his...
An hour-long, unsurprising history lecture. Like, we can tell you don't like history lectures. History lecture? Oh no.
Yeah, I don't understand the complaint either. It's like, okay, Putin tries to contextualize his speeches using history. That's kind of a good thing.
He's not giving any context. He doesn't even mention Donbass in his video.
Yeah, I know. There's like no historical context either. And, you know, I can't say I agree with all of Putin's conclusions in his historical contextualization of what happened, but we're going to get into that in another video. We won't touch that for now.
Grand, intricate argument as to why Ukraine, in fact, isn't a real country.
Another thing I have to say about what he just said. He said that Putin says that Ukraine is not a real country. This is a misunderstanding of what Putin is saying, and let's just take a look at what Putin says right now.
Итак, начну с того, что современная Украина целиком и полностью была создана Россией.
So he says, modern Ukraine as we know it, as a modern entity, was entirely created by Russia. And he's not saying that Ukraine is a fake country. He's not saying that the Ukrainian people have no national identity. He's not saying anything like that. He's actually stating a fact that that Ukraine as a nation state did not exist before it was formed around the time of the Bolshevik Revolution. That's a historic reality.
Instead, Ukraine was created by the authors of the Russian Communist Revolution 100 years ago. And now Ukraine, this invented country that's just an extension of Russia itself, has been hijacked by the US and Europe, who have installed neo-Nazi thugs to run the show. Seriously, he said all of this. You can go watch the hour-long lecture if you want.
Did what Putin say translate to neo-Nazi thugs? Thugs specifically?
No, so far no.
To me, and he makes this point multiple times to act as if Putin is calling Ukrainians thugs and drug users and things like that. And I feel like he's trying to appeal to the American liberals because he's making Putin sound like he's using the same kind of terminology that a lot of like anti-BLM people use. And to me, it just seems like there's some sort of pulling from that narrative that he's trying to force onto Putin on a completely unrelated topic, part of the world.
Black Lives Matter is a Marxist organization, and all of a sudden it becomes like sort of, although now if you look, it's going way down because people are tired of this stuff, what's going on, the Black Lives Matter. If you look at what's going on with the bats and a lot of thugs.
According to his story, the West did this to eventually force Ukraine into their military alliance called NATO, which they will use to defeat Russia. Just like, and seriously he says this, just like Hitler did 80 years ago. But this time, Putin will make sure that Russia is ready for the invasion.
I mean, I honestly think there's anything that ridiculous about the claim that NATO is trying to use Ukraine as a means to attack Russia. That's basically exactly what's happened. It's not a story. We could look at Euromaidan in 2014 about how, you know, that wasn't a democratic revolution. That was That was neo-fascists and neoliberals, people who support the EU in an alliance, trying to take power, and they did. And the State Department supported it 100%. They gave them their full political support. They gave them money. They've been funding and arming their government ever since. This is well documented.
Just look at the history. Every country that's ever invaded Russia, they've used Ukraine to get to Russia. He's making a historical fact when he says that every Ukraine is being used as a puppet of U.S. colonialism to contain Russia. So he's true in this.
Второй раз мы такой ошибки не допустим.
Oh gosh, there is a lot to unpack here.
Oh my gosh, so much to unpack. Again, I've been hit. I really get hit hard by the cringe that this guy instills in me. I mean, it was hard enough to get through the first video, but the second one again with this, I don't even know what it is. Lady Izdahar, I think it's what this like narcissism that you described, that he tries to make himself look like this super serious guy. He's like so fed up with Putin's lies.
His relatable moments of joking are just so fabricated that it's hard to trust him.
Request to our viewers to support us on Patreon to help us pay for our therapy sessions for when we watch his videos.
Yeah, please. We're all gonna need it.
This is hard to unpack. Like, how hard is it to unpack? I don't know, being on the border of Donbass, Don. Like, how hard is it to unpack to, report news all day? He thinks this is hard.
Yeah, I know. It's like it's like the situation. I mean, it's pretty easy to unpack if you look at all the facts, and also, I mean, it's even easier if you talk to people who were coming from there. I mean, I don't know if people watching this video know, but I was in the Russian region of Rostov, right before the military operation began, and through the first several days of it. Our region was even bombed by the Ukrainians when I was there. And we were talking to people who were evacuating from the People's Republics because, let me remind you, the security services of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics had information early on of an impending Ukrainian invasion, which is one of the main reasons why Russia started this special operation in the first place. And a week before, or maybe several days before this Russian operation was declared and the Ukrainians already started their offensive, they called for an evacuation of men, of women and children and men who were not of fighting age, and over 100,000 people fled to Russia. I was there. I talked to tons of them, hundreds of people I did interviews with for Russia Today, and the vast majority of them were talking about how the Ukrainians had been bombing them for 8 years, about how they could never trust Ukraine again. They'll never be part of that country because they were committing acts of genocide and war crimes against them. And there were barely any people that I talked to that didn't have tears in their eyes. And when Russia recognized the independence of these places, there were celebrations in the streets. The people who were evacuated from Donbass and from Donbass, who were in Russia, where I was at the time, they were celebrating, drinking. There were fireworks. It was a crazy celebration. We know that the Ukrainian military was resuming an offensive before Russia declared its military operation, and the Russian military actually just today found documents that there were secret documents that outlined Ukraine's plans for a resumed offensive. This whole it just goes to show that actually this entire situation was an invention of Ukraine to begin with. They were the first ones, along with the United States, to start saying that Russia was planning to invade Ukraine several months ago. The European security services themselves, even at first, were like, we don't have any information to suggest that. And then obviously, probably after a little bit of backroom talking with the US intelligence services, they got on board because they're like, get with the program. But this was basically the creation of Ukraine and the United States to begin with.
The neo-Nazi thug thing, I will get to that in a second, but the message was clear. Putin was basically like, Ukraine, if you're gonna disavow communist Russia and all of the things that it gave to you, you don't deserve the land that you got from communist Russia. And in fact, all of this land still belongs to Russia, and we're gonna take it back.
Вы хотите декоммунизации? Ну что же, нас это вполне устраивает. Но не нужно, что называется, останавливаться на полпути. Мы готовы показать вам, что значит для Украины настоящая декоммунизация.
But this warped historical framing of who rightfully owns this land isn't quite enough to justify an invasion, maybe in like 1860 or something.
Okay, so there's another randomly thrown around year. But the second thing is that this is not even, I can't say it enough, this is not one of the things that Russia went into this operation with. They're not trying to rule Ukraine. This is, again, just a complete straw man argument by the West.
Also critiques Putin, saying he has a warped framing of history while throwing out random historical dates. And I feel like the way that he's throwing out these past dates, none of them hitting points where like Russia was at war with any area of what is today Ukraine. I feel like it's that sort of notion that people in the past were just stupider, you know? And I hate that sort of framing that people were more volatile and more dumb and got into more conflict, because people of the past were using all the information that they had at that time. And I think it's really problematic to try and view the past as if they're just silly people getting into wars.
So Putin needs to really emphasize the villains in his story. So he makes a big part of his story this idea that Ukraine, this fake country, is being run by American-backed anti-Russian neo-Nazis who are holding the Ukrainian people hostage.
Неудивительно, что украинское общество столкнулось с ростом крайнего национализма, который быстро приобрел форму агрессивной русофобии и неонацизма.
Okay. It's easy to poke fun at like the delusion of Vladimir Putin, but
what is so delusional about that? That seems like reality. I mean, that is the reality. I mean, and we'll get into the video soon. We'll get into the part of the video soon where Johnny seems to think that elected officials are the ones that run what happens in a country. But for people who actually dig a little deeper, you understand that these people are also accountable to other people, and it's people with money.
He's right when he says that Russophobia has been on the rise and the far-right nationalism has been on the rise, which is evident by the fact that Russian language has been banned. They can't speak Russian language. People who want to speak Russian language are being suppressed. That's in the Donbas region, the region that he doesn't talk about once in his video. And Russian channels are banned. So everything Russian is banned. So how can you say that the country is not aggressive to Russia?
Yeah, I mean, I agree 100%. And it also shows in the fact that, I mean, this kind of surge in ultranationalism and Russophobia, this is basically what has allowed the Ukrainian military to indiscriminately kill people in Donbass with the justification that they're just like lousy, basically they're just lousy Russians. That's how they see them. They see them as like Russian-backed separatists, as at best. At worst, they see them as, you know, Russian occupiers, the people who are actually living there. They see them as collaborators of a Russian occupation, but there was no Russian occupation in Donbass throughout the 8 years that, throughout the previous 8 years. I was there many times. There's no Russian occupation.
Just look at what's happening right now around us. This Russophobia has gone international and it's making new records. Russian trees are cancelled. Russian cats are cancelled. Dostoevsky is cancelled. Tchaikovsky concerts are being cancelled. People are cancelling Bolshoi ballet bookings.
It happened so fast and with little pushback as well. It's like so accepted, like the world was ready, because it's almost 100 years of Red Scare propaganda in the making, to the point where people are not even bothered by this overt banning of Russian things that have nothing to do with anything going on.
It just goes to show that all the people that are saying these sanctions are hitting the Russian government and not actual Russian people, first of all, that's just like lip service. This has no bearing on reality, because second of all, the sanctions are hurting everyone in Russia. I mean, the depreciation of the ruble hurts everyone here. The fact that certain products aren't allowed, are banned now because the companies, well, not banned, but the fact that the companies have left and there's no more products here that previously came from foreign countries. I mean, all this combined just goes to show that forces in the West have been looking for a reason for a long time to attack the Russian people in general.
Let's talk about the facts here and what Putin is actually basing this off of, because it really matters for understanding why he went in and why he's going to lose. First, let's just clear up the fact that Ukraine wasn't invented by Russia. Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, was a thriving city long before Moscow was even on the map. Ukraine has a very old culture. But what Putin has done is twisted modern history to make a claim that Ukraine actually isn't a legitimate country.
Okay, first of all, that's true about Kiev, but notice that he uses the terms Kiev and Ukraine interchangeably. When it's not really fair to do that when you consider what Putin's actually trying to say, because Kiev is very old, that's true, and Ukrainian culture's been around for a long time and everything, but they did not have a nation state at that point. Putin is specifically talking about the creation of the Ukrainian nation state, which did not exist back then.
And it's kind of a nice little visual history lesson he was giving, but it is a false equivalency. But yeah, in Eastern Europe, there's a very similar saying as, all roads lead to Rome. In Eastern Europe, it was all roads lead to Kiev. So he's not wrong about its prominence. It's just not the same thing as the country of Ukraine.
Yeah, and also Russia doesn't deny the existence of that culture. I mean, they're not saying that I'm kind of surprised that Johnny thinks he's like such a serious journalist, and then he thinks that what Putin's trying to say can be so simply dismissed. That, well, Kiev's been around for hundreds of years, so Ukraine isn't just an invented thing. That is like such a simplistic understanding of what Putin was trying to say, and because of that, he misunderstands what Putin's trying to say.
And he does this because it's a very key part of his story, one that supports the second major argument.
And you know what? Another thing I have to mention, and we haven't gotten into neo-Nazis yet, but for all of the historical context that Johnny tries to bring into this video, all of the historical context he tries to bring in to say that Kiev has existed for hundreds of years, which nobody is arguing with, he doesn't once talk about. He tries to play down the existence of neo-Nazis in Ukraine, and not once does he talk about the long history of that goes back to Nazi collaboration, the massive amount of Nazi collaboration that took place in Western Ukraine, the insurgency of Nazi collaborators that continued into the 1950s against the USSR. He doesn't talk about the fact that a lot of this was actually, had precursors in this old Kiev that he's talking about, with the fact that, anti-Semitism was rampant across what is now current Ukraine throughout hundreds of years as well. That is also a factor that he fails to mention.
Which is that Ukraine is run by neo-Nazis who want to exterminate the Russian-speaking population. So let's get the facts here. Within Ukraine, there is indeed a faction of far-right neo-Nazis who have a political party and a militia force.
Okay, so this is something I wanted to mention. So he says there's a faction of neo-fascists in Ukraine. That's true. Then he says they have a political party and a militia. That's not true, okay? That's like totally, that is distorting the significance, that's downplaying the significance of the existence of fascists in Ukraine. They have at least two major political parties. You could say the Svoboda Party, which is a neo-Nazi organization, political party. They've got Right Sector, which is another self-described, like neo-fascist, ultranationalist organization. There's no arguing that they are neo-Nazis. I mean, they glorify Stepan Bandera, who was literally a Nazi collaborator, and he was the leader of the anti-Soviet insurgency that consisted of Nazi collaborators throughout even after the Nazi regime collapsed. So those are two major political parties in Ukraine. As for militias, there's a lot more than one, and I could just off the top of my head list three of them. There's the Azov Battalion, which is an official army brigade of the Ukrainian National Guard. That's the one that everyone knows. It's like the most common one, but it's not nearly the only one. There's also Right Sector, which I just mentioned is a political party. They also have their own military arm, which is fighting against Donbass and the Russians. There's the state-funded, I'm pretty sure it's S-14 or S-19, I can't remember the actual number, but it's a state-funded militia in Ukraine that has also collaborated many times with the Ukrainian military. These are just, I've just given you 5 examples of neo-Nazi organizations that are not fringe in Ukraine, and there are more.
The media has done a pretty good job of making sure that there are a ton of Nazis in Ukraine. They've reported so many images of actually Ukrainian soldiers, even women, with Nazi insignias, patches on their uniforms, and people holding Pravi sector flags, the red and black flag. That's the if someone doesn't know, and Canadian cultural minister participating in a rally with Pravi sector flags. NATO account posting pictures of on Women's Day with women showing Nazi symbolism. I mean, they've done a pretty good job of showing that how many Nazis have. There's barely any picture of a Ukrainian soldier without a Nazi insignia on his uniform.
And the fact that they would later take down like the Women's Day posts, means they're very aware of this. So it's not like it's something they don't know about.
They're making a very conscious choice here to show one-sided information and actually shape what people think.
Yeah, and it's social media is collaborating in this as well. I mean, Facebook hates Russia so much, it has temporarily allowed praise of neo-Nazis on Facebook if they are Ukrainians fighting Russia. It's absolutely ridiculous.
And this militia force has actually joined the Ukrainian army in the past 8 years to fight Russia back from annexing any more territory in the east of the country. You may have remembered that Russia took over a big part of Ukraine called Crimea 8 years ago.
Okay, I'm just gonna make a little disclaimer there. He says took over, and he doesn't even mention the referendum that happened, but.
Makes it sound like Crimea is such like an insignificant, just a little place with no historical significance or anything like that.
Ukrainian forces have set up a perimeter, but it's clear that we are completely surrounded by Russian forces.
Yeah, these neo-Nazi fighters, sort of nationalist guys, came up as a resistance to that.
Okay, so these neo-Nazi sort of nationalist guys did not come up as a resistance to that. Lady Izdahar, do you want to talk a little bit about how far back they go?
I just did a really basic search, so it's something anyone can look up, but the roots of Azov specifically come from 1982, from a football club. And if you know anything about football clubs in Europe, there's a lot of racism and a lot of problematic white supremacy in a lot of them, especially in Eastern Europe. And so it's not surprising to see that led to something like this, but you can really easily find this information that did not start in 2014. Its roots are in at least the 1980s.
Yeah, I myself looked at it too. At first I was like, that doesn't sound right. But I didn't know exactly when they were founded, and I found out when actually. Right Sector has been around since 2013 as an official party, although before then, they existed for a while already as a sort of confederation of neo-fascist groups. The Svoboda Party, it was founded actually in either 2003 or 2004, but it had a predecessor party. There was like the Social Nationalist Party of Ukraine or something, and that was organized back in 1991 alongside the collapse of the USSR. These people, you know, when we hear about people being oppressed in the USSR or about people who weren't able to speak their mind, a lot of those people were neo-fascists. This is exactly what we're talking about. And when the USSR fell, these people were allowed to say whatever they wanted.
Right, these are not good people. These are literal neo-Nazi, white supremacist soldiers that commit all sorts of atrocities and train children in their ideology and fighting tactics.
He's saying that they're bad guys, but he's just saying they're on the fringe. We've just demonstrated that they're not. So with the understanding that they're not on the fringe, this part of his video kind of sabotages his whole argument.
people, neo-Nazis, we don't like them. But Putin is claiming that these are the people running the country, running Ukraine, when in fact, if you look at the data from the 2019 election in Ukraine, you'll see that the country's ultra-nationalist far-right coalition gained barely over 2% of the vote and 0 seats in the parliament. They are a small group of extremely fringe far-right fighters.
I know what he's referencing there too, because Right Sector and Azov Battalion, for being such fringe organizations, they've actually over the years organized like children's indoctrination camps. You know, my understanding of fringe is kind of like, I mean, what I remember to be like the communist movement in the United States, right? I mean, we could consider ourselves fringe. You know, we're like in the belly of we were in the belly of the beast in the United States, at least when I was there, and I don't know, I can't think of any parties that could have afforded to have camps to indoctrinate children.
Oh, and there's a more obvious bit of data here, which is that the Ukrainian president is Jewish and has family who died in the Holocaust. Ukraine is not run by neo-Nazis.
This is like the biggest mainstream media trope as to why there are no fascists or whatever. You know, that the fascists don't control stuff in Ukraine. But it's just such a misnomer because, like, Russia's not saying that Zelensky is a neo-Nazi. They're not saying that his cabinet of people are even neo-Nazis. They're saying that the government is accountable to these neo-Nazi groups and they can't do pretty much anything that far away from what these neo-Nazi groups want them to do because they're the ones with the guns and the willingness to fight. And they're the ones that are funded and armed by the US and NATO. So it's the US and NATO that's calling the shots basically from these neo-fascists. If for example, Zelensky thought maybe one day he's just going to decide to be friendlier with Russia, I don't know. These neo-Nazi groups would not allow him to do that. I mean, in 2015 we saw that when Poroshenko, who was the president at the time, diverted from what these armed neo-fascist groups wanted, they almost overthrew the government.
That is the 2019 general election. I would also like to cite that election because the results of those elections are pretty interesting. Apart from what they call the occupied areas, the People's Republics, whole of Eastern Europe, they all voted for Yuri Boyko. And Yuri Boyko is actually one of the main proponents of closer relations with Russia. And if he's going to cite 2019 elections, I think he should also cite that the region that actually wants closer relations with Russia has actually welcomed this military operation.
Yeah, that's an important thing to note as well, because I don't think anyone, don't think anyone in Russia expected all of Ukraine to lay down their weapons and say, please, Russia, save us. I don't think that's what anyone expected. I mean, everyone understands there's two factions in Ukraine. There's these pro-Western people who really, their legacy comes from Nazi collaborators, and there's pro-Russian people whose legacy comes from the partisans who fought Nazi collaborators. And this is why, I mean, before Euromaidan happened, this is why pretty much every other election there was a pro-West president, there was a pro-Russian president, but the pro-Westerners, they broke the system. And that's that's really the more recent cause of why there's a civil war going on right now.
Listen, to balance my view on this, because I'm in the West and I'm getting all Western media, I have actually been watching Russian state TV to see what the narrative is on their side. And I can tell you that they actually believe that the country is run by Nazis.
It is reminiscent of the practices and methods of Nazi Germany.
And we're seeing a full revival of Nazism and fascism in Ukraine.
Okay, so these RT clips that he showed right there, they don't actually say that Ukraine is run by neo-Nazis. They just talked about how there's a revival of neo-Nazism in Ukraine, which is not at all far from the truth. That's true. I mean, and he even admitted that was the case, although he had some strange understanding that neo-Nazi groups only showed up after Crimea became part of Russia. But he himself said there was a rise of ultranationalism and neo-Nazism, and that's exactly what these RT reports are saying.
Also noticed how as soon as he said like Russian state media and played RT, like the music changed. To me, it just seems really manipulative. I understand that that's like a common tactic in any sort of, narrative like this, but the fact that it's so evident the kinds of music that he's playing around certain clips. Also, Don, I think you should mention maybe what it means to be state-funded television or news in Russia.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about that because I myself work at RT, but Johnny has the same understanding too that a lot of people in the West have, that if we're state-funded media, we just have to toe the line of the government here. That's just not true. I mean, there's a regulatory organization. I can give you one example. There's a regulatory organization in Russia called Roskomnadzor, which is supposed to regulate what TV can do and say and whatever. And we technically fall under their jurisdiction. And they've said that they don't want this military operation to be called a war. And if you watch RT, you'll see that at the beginning of every broadcast, our introductory clip says "War in Ukraine." These are like pretty much just like guidelines for us. Our entire editorial line we come up with ourselves. I was never told what to say by some Russian bureaucrat in the Kremlin. This is just kind of like a ridiculous thing to say. And also, I'm not talking bad on RT or anything. I think RT is a great source of information if you only speak English, you don't speak Russian, and you want to understand what the Russian perspective is. But to really understand the entire argument here of what Russia's trying to make, you really have to at least go on to exclusively Russian language sources like TASS or RIA Novosti, and at least put them through a Google Translator or something, because a lot of this information that comprises the research that's been done to support the Russian position and the complexities of what Russia's saying about this whole situation, a lot of that is not even translated into English. So you can't even really get the full picture just listening to what is translated into English.
Make a minor point here that Don said that there's an organization, Roskomnadzor, in Russia that supervises everything what's being said on TV. I just wanted to say that people should not perceive it as like a censorship apparatus. Every country has a supervision organization. United Kingdom has Ofcom. Every country has an organization that looks after what's being said on TV to actually not violate the guidelines, to not actually promote offensive or hateful stuff.
This sort of narrative of state-funded TV and news really what's the word? It disproportionately affects Russian and Chinese news programs.
Yeah, and there's the Western media, they always, or people in the West, they always, have a different understanding of what, for example, BBC and RT are, even though they both receive state funds. Technically, BBC is considered publicly funded, and RT is considered state funded. Basically, the only difference of that is that RT receives money from a government department, from directly from the state. As for BBC, its funds are, as I understand, raised through a tax. So they collect the money they make through a tax. But it's kind of they're both state money. They're both coming from from taxpayers one way or the other. It's just kind of formalistically different.
I've tried to dig into this to try to understand, is there more meat on the bone here? No, there's not. A fringe group of militiamen in the Far East are what Putin is basing this off of. Over here in reality land, Ukraine is a nation of 44 million people with its own culture that is thousands of years old. It is a country where fewer and fewer people like Russia. In fact, it's a country that ousted the pro-Russian leader in 2014. The people don't want Russia and Putin anymore. They've moved on. But all of these facts are explained away very conveniently by Putin's bigger conspiracy, which is that it's actually outside forces that are pulling the strings, and that the people of Ukraine have been brainwashed by the West. And yet there is one thing that Putin is absolutely right about.
Это наши товарищи, близкие. среди которых не только коллеги, друзья, бывшие сослуживцы, но и родственники. Люди, связанные с нами кровными семейными узами.
These two countries are deeply connected through culture and language and history and exchange. A war against Ukrainians would not sit well with the Russian people. And this explains why Putin needs to frame the war in a very certain way. Not an invasion to take over a sovereign nation of Russia's brothers and sisters, but rather a rescue effort to save the Ukrainian people from these aggressive villains who are really controlling the country.
В курсе ли всех этих управленческих методов сами украинцы? Понимают ли, что их страна находится даже не под политическим и экономическим протекторатом, а сведена до уровня колонии с марионеточным режимом?
Okay, I'm about to jump into the maps and look at how the war is actually playing out and to help us understand it. But I really, really want us to keep in mind Putin's story because it really will make everything click. So let's just go over it really quickly. Putin's story is really four things. Number one, Ukraine really belongs to Russia. Number two, it has been hijacked by the US and Europe, i.e. the West. Number three, the West is controlling Ukraine with its neo-Nazi puppets, also that the West military alliance called NATO can use Ukraine as a bridge to get to Russia, who they want to defeat. And all of this leads to Putin must invade to free Ukrainians and protect Russia from the West. That is it. That is the justification that Vladimir Putin has been building for years, if not decades.
Missing some very key elements, like regarding Donbass. This is all according to him.
Yeah, this is all like a projection of what he's interpreted Putin's motives are, even though he doesn't even know him. I mean, the biggest thing is that I think the most confused thing in what he just showed was that he said this is a mission to free Ukrainians. The main reason why, and this is something that Vladimir Putin said, the main reason why the Russian military even went into Ukraine, past the borders of the People's Republics, is because the Russian state sees no other option for the safety of Russia as well as for the safety of the People's Republics, but to make sure that Ukraine is demilitarized and denazified. But they don't have plans to take over Ukraine. Russia sees Ukraine as a separate entity, and they're not planning to occupy it. But the fact is that Ukraine has behaved itself in such a predatory manner for the past 8 years, ever since this Euromaidan thing happened, that Russia cannot trust that they're just gonna not do something like what they did right before the Russian military operation again if they're not demilitarized. Because especially because Kiev has not relinquished its claim to Crimea or the People's Republics. They still consider that Ukrainian territory. And that's another one of Russia's major demands here in the negotiations. They want Ukraine to drop their claims on the People's Republics and Crimea. And they still have not.
Russian concerns of Ukraine being a puppet regime are 100% justified.
100%.
Let me tell you why. Recently, very recently, in the past few days, the Russian Ministry of Defense has released documents that clearly state that there were US-funded bioweapon, I won't say bioweapon, but bioresearch, that's what they call them, bioresearch labs in Ukraine, plenty of them spread all across Ukraine, and that they were working on deadly pathogens, anthrax, plague, and they were in vicinity of the Russian border.
Yeah, this is something that I heard reports about for many years already, actually, about these biological labs. I always thought perhaps it was like some sort of conspiracy theory. I mean, I never saw evidence until now. You know, I'm actually pretty shocked even at the fact that the US admitted that they have these biological labs. That is crazy stuff.
Повторю, наши действия – это самозащита от создаваемых нам угроз и от еще большей беды, чем та, что происходит сегодня.
Minutes after this second address last week, where he laid out all of his justifications, in the middle of the night, the rockets start flying and the tanks start rolling. This is how it started. What is becoming the most consequential war in Europe since World War II. A pretend rescue effort.
The most consequential war in Europe since World War II. completely ignoring Yugoslavia.
Muslims were involved, so that's probably another factor as to why it doesn't count.
Oh yeah, that just adds to the not caring levels of America.
Framed as an operation to denazify the country. Russia comes in from all sides, quickly taking over mostly rural areas, but slowly moving towards the major cities.
The country is being attacked from all directions. Some of those Russian troops are heading here to the capital.
In addition to tanks and troops taking over land, Russia also starts firing missiles that hit targets all throughout the country.
This has come out of nowhere. Who resist?
I just want to mention something he said earlier, how he said that the Russian military was taking over primarily rural lands, as if it was a bad thing, like, oh, they're only taking the rural parts. Most of Ukraine is rural.
Oh, I tell you what, I just heard a big bang right here.
This video has been going around for a very long time, and everybody on Twitter was claiming that, oh, Russia is saying that we're only targeting military infrastructure, but look at this, they're actually targeting civilian infrastructure. What was going on in this building? Well, I'll tell you what was going on in this building. This missile struck this building at 8 a.m. Azov Battalion put out a recruitment advertisement on Telegram, calling people to volunteer for them at about 10 a.m. And this missile strike was actually done at a Azov recruitment center. Azov battalion soldiers are actually inside the building that this missile struck. So it was not a civilian target. But if you consider neo-Nazi civilians, I don't know what to tell you.
Yeah, and another thing to mention about this video as well, I'm glad you brought that up, is that local media at the time when this happened were very confused. They were like, there are not Russian forces in the area from which the missile must have come. That was the first indication that something was fishy, you know.
The invasion, the attack that Russia promised would never happen, has now started.
People who live in Kyiv are sleeping in underground subway stations. It's the only place they feel safe.
Ukrainians fled to basements, to bomb shelters.
Some people are adjusting to this new reality.
So I think by Johnny showing these news clips, he's obviously trying to evoke a sort of emotional reaction in connection to the Ukrainians that have to, spend days in the subway because of war, basically. And that sucks. I don't think that's a good thing that anyone has to go through that. But the fact of the matter is that in this video, nothing is mentioned about the fact that Donbass has been living like that for the past 8 years. Again, no mention of Donbass. The fact that children have been living their lives in basements for the past 8 years because of indiscriminate Ukrainian bombings, that they've been running to school because they don't want to get shelled on the way there. There's just absolutely no mention of it. It's as if Johnny doesn't even know what Donbass is. He used RT. If he was really watching RT, then he definitely knows about what Donbass is, and he just has decided to leave it out.
We'll see how the people in the Donbass region have been living in basements in our upcoming documentary. Like, we actually show how we actually go inside a basement and show how people have been living there, literally counting the days of how many days they've actually had to spend inside those basements in dark without electricity.
Yeah, we were able to meet up with one resident who actually gave us a tour of the bunker in which his family spent the worst days of 2014.
Living in a country now at war.
Hundreds of thousands fled to the borders west of the country.
I'm going to sound like a broken record here, but again, no mention of the over 100,000 people that left from Donbass into Russia. It's like exclusively West Ukrainian centric.
Looking for safety.
Others are taking trains to the west to get out of the country.
They are fleeing into neighboring countries like Moldova, Romania, and Poland.
At the city's central train station, a frantic dash as people try to escape to the west of the country.
But wait, remember Putin's story? According to this story, after this initial invasion, Ukrainians were going to wake up from their slumber and welcome him with open arms. The neo-Nazi president was going to flee, and Ukraine would be returned to Russia, Putin becoming the savior of the Russian motherland. But that is exactly what didn't happen.
Outgunned and outnumbered.
Again, this is a straw man argument. Did you want to say something, Lady Izdahar?
I mean, yes, remember the story that I made up for Putin? It didn't go exactly as planned.
Yeah. This all seems to be the result of the story of one man's sick fantasies, but it doesn't seem to be Putin's.
Ukrainian soldiers and civilians alike are mounting a stiff resistance.
I used to teach maths and physics, but 2 days ago the Russian army took control of my town, so I signed up to fight.
Every day Ukrainians are taking to the streets to fight for their homeland.
Let those Russian shits come here, she says. We are ready to greet them.
We are ready to fight. And fight like hell.
This is my city, this is my land, I have to protect it.
You do not feel that they're going to succeed in taking out your administration and your government?
No way. They will never take Kyiv.
The response of Ukrainians, both military and civilian, is where Putin's story starts to crumble.
The entire world is witnessing the determined and brave resistance by the Ukrainian army and population.
I have never seen Ukraine that united.
And as for the president of Ukraine, the alleged neo-Nazi drug addict thug puppet of the West, well, the US actually offered to airlift him out of the country for his own safety. Instead of taking the offer, his response was, quote, "The fight is here. I need ammunition, not a ride." Which, by the way, that quote has been turned into a t-shirt that you can buy on Amazon.
Ukrainians are fighting for love of country. Russians are fighting out of a fear of a dictator.
In the event of Russia opting for escalation, Ukraine will defend itself.
He then sent a video around to the country of him in central Kiev, making it known that he is staying, he is fighting. So despite being totally outmatched militarily, Ukrainians are fighting back, showing that the outcome of a war is as much determined by the courage.
So I think it goes without saying that in any conflict there's going to be two sides. And in a country where there are so many neo-Nazis and ultranationalists, obviously tons of people are going to be against the Russian side. I mean, that's been the story of Ukraine basically since its inception, as we've been talking about throughout this entire video. It's stuck between two sides. But again, Russia's not trying to annex Ukraine. It's trying to protect Donbass and its own national security.
They're turning slogans of people suffering into commodities.
Yeah, it goes to show the way they're seeing these sanctions as well, or their economic way of attacking Russia. You know, they're all saying that, like you said, they're trying to turn this war into they're trying to commodify it, and at the same time, their biggest attack on Russia is like, you're not going to have iPhones anymore.
Courage and patriotism of the population, as it is by the number of missiles and troops that you have.
Будут наступать войска, если у нас попытаются отнять нашу страну, нашу свободу, наши жизни, жизни наших детей.
Him justifying the Ukrainian people having all of this ambition and fight, but it's like, I've not seen his past videos on other conflicts if he's made them, but would he say the same thing about Palestinians standing their guard and fighting back for their land? I don't know.
Мы будем защищаться, не наступать, защищаться. Наступая, вы будете видеть наши лица, не наши спины, наши лица.
I've been talking to people inside Ukraine and seeing this devotion firsthand.
How is morale right now among you and among the people you're talking to?
Honestly, extremely high.
Just someone who follows him. So who is he? Who is he talking to?
Yeah, nobody knows.
No background.
Ukrainians aren't letting this conquest happen, and in doing so, they are turning Putin's argument, his story, on its head, and foiling what appears to be his initial strategy for wrangling Ukraine back into his sphere of influence. One Ukrainian I talked to said that there's a waiting list for the Ukrainian army.
Our regional defense won't accept any more people because it's packed.
The queues are growing.
And you cannot even get in right now.
Men volunteering to fight.
Molotov cocktail.
Not accepting any more people also means they don't have the equipment or security to provide all of these people with proper, everything you need for the war.
For those who want to fight but don't have a gun.
A tweet from the Ukrainian Defense Ministry to prepare Molotov cocktails to throw at the occupiers.
I am here in order to protect my family, my country.
There is an incredible sense of unity here. The morale is very high.
Okay, this sounds all positive, and it is, but this is still war, and Putin can still conquer a lot of land. He can take over major cities, install a puppet government, and be the new ruler of Ukraine. He has the military to do it, and he seems to have the tolerance for bloodshed. He seems to believe in his fantasy story so much that he's gonna keep up this crusade. But I'm here to tell you that Putin has already lost this war. I mean, let's play this out so I can show you what I mean. Let's say Putin keeps going. He keeps sending troops in and missiles despite all of this resistance. He could eventually take over the major population centers, including the capital Kyiv. All of this with the same goal that he's had the whole time, which is getting the Ukrainians to give up and realize that Russia is actually the country they want to align with. He's also kind of hoping that maybe the Ukrainian military will come to their senses and take over the government and negotiate with Putin. But let's say they never do, they probably won't. Instead, they keep doing what they've been doing for the last week, resisting, defending, condemning, and broadcasting all of it to the world on the internet. So Putin has no choice but to drive the government out and install a pro-Russian regime. In order to do this, he's going to need a massive military presence to keep control of these cities and their people. It's now costing him tens of billions of dollars and crippling his economy, which, by the way, is only like the size of Texas.
Thing to say, like, why? First of all, that's rude. It's unnecessary. It's rude. Viewers from Texas just unsubscribed from him.
I mean, one of the biggest knocks on Putin's plan is the sheer size of Ukraine. Let's zoom out and realize that Ukraine is huge. It's the biggest country in Europe, if you don't count Russia, the giant country that extends into Asia. Occupying this entire landmass would be basically impossible for Russia. So you have a map that maybe looks something like this, which gives plenty of space for Ukrainians to gather and mount their resistance, giving Russia hell for an indefinite period of time. Meanwhile, back home in Russia, they've now seen the imagery from the ground. They now see that Putin's story justifying this invasion is total BS. There's no Nazis, there's no brainwashing of the people. Instead, in this scenario, Russians are thinking of deaths of our Ukrainian brothers and sisters, while also destroying the Russian economy.
Almost every Russian has someone from Ukraine, either a friend or a relative or a colleague. This is a war between brother nations.
Protesters in the streets demonstrating against Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine.
I'm in Moscow, and I could say that these protests are they're not close to what we even saw when Navalny was not in prison yet, and what we were around the time of coronavirus. That was actually there were much more widespread protests across Russia at that time. I think the reason a lot of people oppose the military operation here is because they don't really understand entirely that, their entire slogan is no war, and they don't understand that the war started 8 years ago, that this Russian military operation seeks to put an end to it. And so I think that's what, I think it's mostly because people don't know that much about the conflict.
On top of all of that, the rich Russian business guys who keep Putin in power, the oligarchs, they aren't happy because the entire world has cut Russia off.
Yeah, well, the reality is that the oligarchs are kept in power thanks to Putin. That was the whole thing. That's why the West doesn't like Putin, because he controls. It's a form of state capitalism. I see Putin kind of as a Bonapartist. If you don't know what that is, I wrote an article about it. You can find it on the Revolution Report website. But basically, in short, it's a state strongman that actually tells the capitalists what to do, and that's kind of how it is in Russia. That's what happened when Putin came to power. He sat the oligarchs down and he was like, "Look, you can either get with the program of national development, or you can get the hell out," because there were oligarchs that had a different plan in mind of where they had their assets abroad and they wanted to make money at the expense of the country. Putin said, you're going to be able to keep doing business if you make money in a way that helps the country develop. And, so this isn't the oligarchs keeping Putin in power here.
Russian billionaires moving their yachts, scrambling their jets, and shifting their assets to prepare for a possible crackdown.
They can't access their financial reserves. Their ability to move money is made much more difficult. People aren't letting their trade vessels into ports.
New efforts by U.S. law enforcement to make Russian oligarchs feel the pain of Putin's war.
I remember this about this guy getting his super yacht seized. There was that actually made headline news in Russia, and some other famous Russian woman was like, she was like, I've always said you should keep your super yachts in Russian ports. This is why.
I mean, this is effectively what sanctions do. So the oligarchs are now like, dude, Putin, WTF, and they put pressure on him to stop this madness. But even still, Putin has enough power that he could still dig in his heels and keep trying to get Ukrainians to come under his rule. But by this point, Ukrainians are done with Putin. They see his true colors. Anyone who was on the fence before has now witnessed civilians being killed in Putin's war of choice. They won't come on his side now. The upshot here is that there's not really a scenario where Putin keeps going and gets what he wants. And that's because the story that he based this invasion off of is proving to be totally wrong. All of these assumptions that he predicated his war on turned out to be the delusions of a pseudo-history buff stuck in the logic of the Cold War, not the realities on the ground today. At another point to the Against Putin camp.
He's old enough to have lived through a lot of history, by the way.
Yeah, I mean, he's Putin actually. I've heard a lot of his speeches. He's very well versed in history. I mean, I think the pseudo history buff here is more Johnny, because he doesn't even mention Donbass or Nazi collaboration in his his historical contextualization of the whole issue we're talking about here.
Putin's war has united the West and NATO like never before. NATO has a new sense of purpose, a new thing to rally around, something they've been looking for since the end of the Cold War. And Ukraine, who is currently getting tons of support and weapons and money and aid and refugee support from NATO countries, is now way more likely to sympathize with the West. Because now they've seen the realities of what Putin has to offer, which is falsehoods and unprovoked conflict.
Johnny's saying that NATO found a new sense of purpose because Vladimir Putin decided to embark upon this military operation, but I think I think he has it backwards. I think NATO has been trying to justify its existence for a while now, and they created this situation to do just that. That's what I think. Because otherwise they can't prove that they're a defensive organization, because they're not. They've only acted entirely aggressively ever since throughout its entire existence, but after the fall of the USSR, even more so. The organization was supposed to it was supposed to contain communism. Why is it still around? To contain Russia.
I mean, I still don't see where he mentioned why he's going to lose the war. Like, what exactly did he say that makes it for Putin not being the one to win? Did you pull any of that away from it?
I think it's pretty vague, but I think the entire point that he's trying to make by saying that Putin's not going to win the war is based on a false premise. I think the premise that Johnny is basing this entire idea off of is that Vladimir Putin has declared this military operation to occupy and take over Ukraine, which is a completely false premise. And that would be disastrous. I mean, if the Russian military had to decided that it was going to take all the major cities and decide it was going to annex Ukraine and then try to get it under control and try to stomp out an insurgency that would inevitably come up in such a situation. But that's not what Russia has said it wants to do at all. If for anyone who's been listening to what Russian politicians have been talking about, Vladimir Putin, Sergei Lavrov, they've been saying they don't want to annex Ukraine. They don't have military occupation in their mind. They don't even want to overthrow the government in Kiev. They want demilitarization and denazification and for Ukraine not to become a NATO country. They're trying so hard to make that happen by simply negotiating with the Ukrainian government. Negotiations have gone on for days now. There's already been 3 rounds of negotiations, and so little has come out of it because the Ukrainian government is not interested in it. They want to actually continue this war. and in which people are dying every day. It's the Ukrainians that want to continue the war. Russia doesn't want to continue it because, yeah, it's harmful to their economy, but they also can't stand by and do nothing while they're being threatened with nuclear weapons and armed neo-Nazi groups that have been bombing Donbass for the past 8 years. So they're stuck in this position. But if Russia's going to occupy Ukraine and take over the country, yeah, that's like a losing battle, but that's not what Russia says it wants to do. So that's why I think this whole video is kind of like based on a false premise.
And I mean, he has a large audience and a large reach. I'm sure if he wanted to, he could find the right people to educate him on this sort of context, but he didn't. That being said, I'm really happy that he didn't demonize the Russian people like so many are doing at this time. Like, that is something I'm really thankful for, that he definitely separated Putin from the average citizen and made some sort of vague comment about Russia having beautiful culture, which, you know, he tried. But if his whole point was to demonize Putin, why not make a video about that and not the war in general? And it's not as if any of us here are giant, like, diehard Putin fans. We all have pretty major critiques, actually. But I feel like the video would have been better suited to just be about Putin and not the war, and, like, you know, him showing off how much he cares about these people that he doesn't really know anything about, and maybe he just learned about in the past week.
I just think that, like, Johnny's whole frame of mind based on this video and the other video that we did a reaction to, is just he makes all these conclusions based on his understanding of Putin's psychological state. I mean, he says in all his videos, like, this is all the creation of what's going on in the head of one man. When in reality, there's tons of socioeconomic factors that play into why what happened the way it did, you know? And that's exactly why we can say that that Ukraine is, you know, accountable, the Ukrainian government's accountable to neo-fascist organizations and the West. Because they, you know, the West calls the shots. They're the ones who put them in power. Could you imagine if the West did not support Euromaidan? I think things would have turned out differently.
People really need to do some introspection as to why all of a sudden people care about this part of the world that even to the West previously has been looked at as lesser. Eastern Europe has a history of being demonized and otherized and being separate from Western Europe. And I feel like the only reason Ukraine is getting sympathy now, other than the fact that they're dealing with a lot of, you know, horrific hardship, is because it's so easy to make Russia the enemy, as it has been historically, even before the Soviet Union.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And that's why a lot of the events that are happening right now in Ukraine are connected to, you know, what was happening during the Cold War and even earlier. So it's important to have historical context in that situation. Anyway, I guess we'll end it here. Yeah. So thanks for watching, everyone, and please let us know what you think about this video in the comment section. Let us know what your take on events is, and workers of the world unite. Hey comrades, thanks a lot for watching our second reaction to Johnny Harris. We hope you liked the video, and we hope that you saw a different perspective to Russia's special operation in Ukraine. Also, make sure to check out Lady Izdahar's content. She's on Instagram, TikTok, YouTube. She's got really interesting content connected to Soviet culture and history, so make sure to check all that out. Now, as always, we want to give a very special thank you to our members on Patreon. First, we have our rank-and-file revolutionaries, Eric, Michael Everson, Paul Shayatovich, Richard Scott Wigton, Edward, Barry G., and Vutsiam Walla. Next, we have our General Secretaries, Medio Elanito, Daniel Hemphill, and Dylan Orris. Thank you all very much for your support. It really helps our work move forward, and it's going to help us a lot in the future as well. So, again, everyone, thanks a lot for watching, and workers of the world unite.